Capcom's Dino Crisis is a fondly remembered game from my childhood, a game I sadly could never finish due to the insane amounts of backtracking that was necessary to do while in search of various items needed for progression, not to mention the fact pretty much every playthrough I started would abruptly come to an end when I inevitably got lost and had no idea where to go next, but it was a fondly remembered game nonetheless. It was terrifying. It was filled with dinosaurs, and it had a kick-ass female lead who wouldn't take crap from anyone.
Oh my god, a leg! A person with no legs!
That's disgusting.
The story puts you in the shoes of protagonist Regina, who is so totally not a clone of another video game heroine, perish the thought, a member of a US secret operation team acronymed SORT. She, along with other members of SORT, Gale, Rick and Cooper, arrive on Ibis Island to rendezvous with fellow member Tom, who's been investigating a research facility on the island that has shady goings-on with a secret non-weapon project. Dr. Kirk is the man leading said project, even though he was reported dead 3 years prior, and so it's up to SORT team to apprehend him and find out what this secret project is all about. During the drop-off, however, Cooper gets blown off course and ends up in the jungle, where he meets a rather grisly end. The team, unaware of Cooper's fate, begin the mission without him, but it soon becomes apparent that they have more to deal with than a mad scientist in hiding. And so the game sets you up with the task of not only tracking down Dr. Kirk, but also finding a way to signal for help off the island, and finding out what exactly this secret project is that Dr. Kirk was working on, all while simultaneously trying to avoid becoming a dinosaur's next meal. Now, while the Resident Evil series may be the more fondly remembered of the two Capcom franchises, Dino Crisis was overall not a disappointing game, selling 2.4 million copies worldwide, with over 300,000 units sold in the game's home country of Japan within its first week of release, making it a commercial success. Critics were positive about Dino Crisis for the most part, but the game was occasionally criticised for being a knockoff of Capcom's at the time few years old and highly successful zombie horror series, which had already released its second game by this point. And because of the similarities to its predecessor, the phrase Resident Evil with dinosaurs was often thrown around against Dino Crisis by both critics and regular gamers alike.
Sweet fucking Jesus!
Look at his eye, what's his eye?
He's a chameleon!
The likeness of both games is not surprising, however, given the director and producer of Dino Crisis, Shinji Mikami, had also directed the first Resident Evil game and even worked as producer on Resident Evil 2. Management of limited inventory space, adorable blocky hand-on-hip characters that have to point with their entire arm rather than a single digit, item mixing as seen in Resident Evil 2, and puzzles galore.
Oh, isn't it great they can't attack you in there? Can you fucking imagine?
Be like, oh, I'll just wait.
Yep, Dino Crisis had all the trademarks of a typical early Resident Evil title. There's even a jump scare involving a raptor in a window that harkens back to the dog jump scare from the first Resident Evil.
Get up, get up, get up!
What was that?
Shut up, it was scary.
But it wasn't all a copy-paste job, and I believe it's unfair to label the game as Resident Evil with dinosaurs, because this dino panic horror, as Capcom once tried to advertise it as, brought to the table features that had not been seen in Resident Evil, features that would even be used in later installments of the zombie-filled horror series. What is panic horror, you may ask? Well, apparently Capcom wanted to try and persuade buyers that Dino Crisis was a completely different experience to Resident Evil, so much so that they gave the saurian scarefest its own classification of panic horror. This short-lived genre would categorize games that featured moments of extreme and sudden terror,
Oh, you sneaky bastard.
as opposed to Resident Evil's slow build-up of suspense, and also featured enemies that were quick on their feet and fast to react, not slow and dumb like the zombies of Resident Evil. It never took off, of course, but I can see what Capcom were trying to go for. Anyway, back onto the topic of what Dino Crisis did differently to its undead counterpart. Instead of the pre-rendered backgrounds of Resident Evil that, in my opinion, while highly detailed, haven't aged terribly well, Dino Crisis utilised a 3D engine with real-time environments. While it meant less overall detail due to hardware limitations and thus the need for a much simpler indoor environment instead of, say, a dense jungle, the game's laboratory setting, mainly composed of white walls and metal panelling, allowed for this shortfall, and also enabled the developers to use a freely moving camera in certain sections that would make for incredibly cinematic and impactful gameplay.
He's kind of running faster than you.
What, you want me to...
Fire!
I don't want to fight.
Fire!
Oh, I think I should have fired.
I've been planking.
To give some examples of the cinematography in Dino Crisis, two of my favourite sections involve the outdoor walkway that Regina can run along. The first time you're shown the walkway, the camera pans along its rails as Regina runs alongside it. It's not a complicated shot by today's standards, but there's something about how the camera follows Regina that gives you the impression of someone, or maybe even something, watching and pursuing her as she runs along the walkway, which in itself brings about a sense of unease. And sure enough, when you revisit the same area later on...
Regina, what happened? The emergency lock on the second floor's just been activated.
I'm a bit busy right now. Do something about it.
Don't sweat it. I'll release the lock.
Now, this could have been an extremely tense and panic-inducing scene without the need for dramatic cinematography, but by having that low-down camera positioned in front of Regina, you give the player both a view of her and the pursuing T-Rex, which further accentuates the fear and realization of how much danger she's in.
Open the door! Open the door!
What?
Wait, what are you supposed to do then?
Open the door! Open the door!
Oh no.
It's a great scene, but I can't help but feel it's wasted on the player when most of their concentration will be spent on trying not to become Mr. T's dinner, and ruined by the slightly awkward tank controls that often see Regina face planting into the wall next to her rather than running straight on ahead, especially if you use the analog sticks for movement. But I don't want to dive into the negative aspects of Dino Crisis just yet, so why don't we take this opportunity to talk about the dinosaurs, the sole reason why anyone unfamiliar with Capcom games would pick this up in the first place. Now, I have to admit, for a game titled Dino Crisis, there is a distinct lack of variation when it comes to the aforementioned creatures. Really, a better title would be Raptor Rampage, or something equally dumb or unimaginative to that effect. Yep, while playing this game, you will spend 80% of your time either fighting or fleeing from velociraptors. There are other dinosaurs in the game, but raptors are your main enemies. However, that doesn't mean they're pushovers.
What? Whoa!
He took his time.
For starters, they're extremely resistant to bullets, especially on harder difficulty settings. A standard raptor will often take minimum 5 shots to kill with the handgun on normal difficulty, and when you come across the stronger blue raptors, considerably more. And with tougher raptors comes more damage inflicted to Regina. Velociraptors are able to swipe and knock Regina's gun out of her hand, headbutt, grab her arm and shake violently, or perform their deadly pin attack. This may not be too much of an issue when starting off the game because you'll come across more medikits than you can carry at first, but if you're not careful later on, you can easily run out and leave yourself in a sticky situation if you get struck too many times. This is where the idea of panic horror sets in. Do you stand your ground and take on that raptor, but risk getting pinned and leaving Regina seriously injured and close to death? Or do you flee into the next room and pray it doesn't follow you? And while some decisions are easy to make, such as diving into one of the various safe rooms dotted about the facility, as dinosaurs can't follow you in there, others are not so simple, like when a raptor patrols a narrow corridor that you have to travel through multiple times. Add in the fact ammo isn't in abundance in Dino Crisis, and you really have to be sure your decision to stand your ground and shoot is a smart one. Now, as mentioned, there are other dinosaurs in Dino Crisis, 4 other species in fact. Obviously we know about the nigh unkillable Mr. T.
I want the max!
Oh, he's doing what is
I got it!
He's a Torino! He just fucking walked into you. He got little arms, he can't grab you.
But there's also the Pteranodon, Compsognathus, and even Tyrannosaurus, with most dinosaurs able to perform their own unique attacks, as well as have resistance to certain weaponry. The Tyrannosaurus only makes brief appearances throughout Dino Crisis, but is the deadliest of the dinosaurs, able to kill Regina in one bite if not careful. You can't take it down with conventional methods. The best you can do is either shoot it enough that it backs away for the time being, or try to run around it and stay away from that nasty set of teeth. Pteranodons I didn't bother with too much, as their attacks are easily evaded by weaving and hurrying inside a building, so I don't really know the best way to kill them. But from what I can gather, they're awkward to shoot and best just being ignored anyway. If given the opportunity, however, they'll swoop down and attempt to knock over Regina, often followed by picking her up in their talons and dropping her from a great height, thus inflicting more damage. While Compsognathus can be killed with one bullet from a standard weapon like the handgun, thus making the compies the weakest enemies in the game, there are so many of them it's best to just keep running and try to avoid being swarmed. And while they can be annoying if they trap you in a corner, they do so little damage that it's not even worth mentioning them, to be honest. Which leaves me to talk about my favourite dinosaur in Dino Crisis and the wackiest of the bunch, Tyrannosaurus. Like the Raptors, these guys have a multitude of attacks. They can swipe at Regina with those deadly clawed hands, knock her on her back and gut her with their clawed feet, a one-shot ability by the way, and even grab her legs and swing her around like a ragdoll, which also results in a one-shot. Basically, these guys are bad news and you'll want to stay as far away from them as possible unless you have a seriously powerful weapon on hand like the grenade gun. It's also odd that they do attack Regina, given Tyrannosaurus was supposedly a herbivore, but hey, maybe they're just being territorial. Sadly, even with all these different abilities the enemies have, encounters can start to feel very stale after a while, specifically because there just isn't enough variety in dinosaurs. Yes, the Tyrannosaurus is a sight to behold and terrifying upon first viewing, but when you've seen one featherless giant chicken with claws lumbering its way towards you, you've seen them all. And unfortunately, as is a problem with most survival horror games, the action goes from nerve-wracking to downright annoying in just a few hours. The 2 Tyrannosauruses blocking a corridor I needed to travel through multiple times were scary at first, but after my 3rd backtracking session they just became stupid fat obstacles that were getting in the way of me finishing this by now slog of a game. I understand that hardware was limited at the time, and given most of Dino Crisis takes place in a claustrophobic indoor facility, it wasn't possible to have humongous dinosaurs like Triceratops running around. But for a game to be titled Dino Crisis, and yet only feature 5 different types of dinosaurs, if you don't include the raptor variations that is, man, that is really disappointing. It's not all doom and gloom, however, and the developers did add a clever mechanic to spice up gameplay, so you wouldn't just be turning up in a room, seeing a dinosaur, and either shooting its brains out or quietly waddling away. And that mechanic was QuickTime events, or QTEs as they're known. Yes, QTEs are considered the bane of many a gamer's existence.
Please! Someone! I'm going to die!
But back in 1999 they weren't used as often as they are now, and hadn't even been implemented into the Resident Evil series yet. And while they're not used in the most innovative of ways during Dino Crisis, having you mash any random button when the danger warning comes up, They do make for some of the most memorable moments of the game, and if said random buttons are not thoroughly mashed in time, some of the most gruesome too. Another mechanic that freshened up the game and even made it worth replaying, despite the monotony of combat and backtracking, was the inclusion of choices you could make throughout the story that would affect which of the game's multiple endings you would receive, a feature that would later be used in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis if I'm not horribly mistaken. So at certain points in the Dino Crisis story, you'll have to make the decision as to whether to go with stone-faced Gale's plan, which usually entails sticking to the mission even if it means putting characters at great risk, or kind-hearted Rick's plan, which often involves Regina's well-being and the rescue of other teammates like Tom. It's a brilliant feature that makes the game worth playing through a second or possibly even third time if you want to witness all three endings. It also makes the character of Regina feel less like your bog-standard no-brain protagonist a la Lara Croft, and makes Regina feel more like a real person that's forced to make tough choices, knowing full well that whatever she decides could result in loss of life or even failure of the mission. And now with all that good stuff out of the way, I have to gripe once again, because it's what I do best, even when I'm playing a game I love. So I know I previously praised the camera in Dino Crisis, and trust me when I say some of the cinematography in this game is fantastic. But the gameplay often falls flat when that very same camera fails to work in conjunction with the extremely tanky controls. So Regina is your typical 90s protagonist when it comes to movement. She has to make large circles in order to turn around. There is a button specifically for 180ing, but in order to use it you have to come to a complete halt. And more often than not, the button doesn't seem to respond. So you press it again and watch in horror as Regina does 2 spins instead of 1, leaving you exactly as you were before, ready to give that charging Velociraptor a big old smooch. Yes, it's not an uncommon trait for 90s video game protagonists to feel like machines rather than real people when it comes to movement, but bear in mind that characters like Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine of Resident Evil, or even Harry Mason of Silent Hill, were usually up against slow-moving enemies. Regina, however, is facing off against fast, agile, hungry dinosaurs, the sort that can not only pin her down and take a good chunk of her health off, sometimes even kill her outright, but even follow her into adjacent rooms to finish her off.
Here's Johnny!
So the last thing you want to do is get stuck on a wall while trying to turn Regina while a pack of compies close in on her position. And like I said, not helping this issue is the camera at times. It's always the bloody camera. At some point during your playthrough of Dino Crisis, you'll find yourself cursing at the screen as you try to move Tank Regina round a corner, or even past a pursuing dinosaur, only for the camera to suddenly change position and completely disorientate you, causing you to run the poor cow into the nearest object or wall. And then to top it all off, there's the combat, or lack thereof in my case. I want to go back to Silent Hill briefly as an example. Now, I loved the fact protagonist Harry Mason was awful with guns. It made sense because he was just a normal guy in a very abnormal situation, and presumably had no prior training with such weapons. He would struggle to aim even with a small handgun unless given time to line up his shot, and couldn't walk at all whilst aiming with a more powerful weapon like the rifle. But it felt right in Silent Hill because Harry was just your regular average Joe, completely out of his depth. So back to Dino Crisis. Now Regina is not only a member of SWORD, but also supposedly a weapons specialist. And yet she can't fire a handgun without standing still? She can run with a gun in hand and even walk slowly while aiming it, but the second you want to shoot, Regina feels the need to come to a complete halt. Not something you really want to do when facing off against an enraged Velociraptor ready to pounce. What Dino Crisis really could have done with to improve upon the combat was a way to dodge enemy attacks. Okay, fine, Regina has to stand still when shooting that tiny weedy gun of hers, but could I at least have the option of a tactical combat roll to avoid that pouncing Velociraptor? Or a way to back up quickly instead of just slowly stepping away? Just something, you know? As it stands, combat in Dino Crisis is a tedious and extremely frustrating affair, and it's such an issue that you'll frequently find trying to kill dinosaurs a complete waste of time, and just soldier on ahead without bothering, even when you have powerful weapons at your disposal such as the shotgun or grenade gun. Now, I didn't keep count, but I think I must have killed no more than 7 dinosaurs at most during almost 6 hours of playtime, simply because I just couldn't be bothered. Yes, you're meant to feel outmatched by a predator as swift and deadly as a velociraptor, but when my decision not to kill it comes out of frustration rather than fear, something seems amiss in a game that's supposed to be labelled panic horror. So yeah, Dino Crisis starts off as a nerve-wracking and heart-pounding experience that sadly degrades into boredom as you try to put up with the monotonous backtracking for various keycards, items or solutions to door codes, with lackluster combat, not enough dinosaurs to keep the game exciting, and both the story and situations Regina finds herself in becoming increasingly more ridiculous as time goes on. To give an example of just how wacky Dino Crisis can get, one of the endings has Regina shooting at Mr. T, who's apparently turned himself into a speedboat as he chases after Regina and the gang in their hovercraft. What is the top speed of a Tyrannosaurus Rex in water anyway? Well, apparently the same as a hovercraft, given how easy it is for Mr. T to keep up. And then, to top off all the craziness, Rick lets loose one of the hovercraft's missiles to blow up a gas container, which engulfs Mr. T in flames. Somehow the hovercraft manages to stay ahead of the Inferno, even though they were both going at the same speed just seconds ago. But then... he's still alive! Mr. T chases after the gang once again, to which Regina finally decides enough is enough, delivering the most ridiculously brilliant line in the entire game. Also, and I know this isn't really the game's fault and is a result of the graphics of the time, but I have to mention it at least once. Why does Mr. T look perfectly fine during in-game cutscenes, but absolutely horrific during pre-rendered ones? Look at him! Has he been stung by a swarm of bees or something? He looks bloody awful. Now, most of the issues that plagued Dino Crisis were ironed out in its sequel, Dino Crisis 2. The developers went back to pre-rendered backgrounds, which meant they could have an outdoor environment. There was a lot more variety when it came to dinosaur species. Using guns was less of a hassle, as characters could now run while shooting with most weapons, and still walk while carrying something extremely heavy and powerful, and the scarcity of ammo was now a thing of the past, as it could be bought at the various computer terminal save stations dotted about the map. That's a game for another day, of course, but it is one I want to review, given it's my most played game of all time. Seriously, I think I was well over my 20th playthrough before I lost the memory card associated with that game. God, I love Dino Crisis 2. Now, whether the Dino Crisis series will receive the remake treatment that Resident Evil 2 was so graciously blessed with remains to be seen. And while Capcom have teased that they plan to revive more of their IPs, given how busy they are with the remake of Resident Evil 3, they probably haven't given much thought to their dinosaur-packed panic horror of the late 90s. I'm sure that if and when they do announce it, however, the hype will be immense. I know there's also a fan remake of Dino Crisis currently being made by 5 people, known as Team Arklay, but whether or not they'll be able to finish the game without receiving a cease and desist from Capcom remains to be seen. It's being made in Unreal Engine 4, and so far it's looking fantastic. I'm not going to hold my breath, given how often fan projects based on existing IPs tend to be smote into the ground, but I wish them all the best with it. If you want to check them out for yourself, I've put a link to their YouTube channel in the description. Anyway, that sums up my review of Dino Crisis. If you've played the game yourself, I'd love to know your thoughts on it. Did you find it scary, or was it too goofy for you? What do you think of the characters? How fast can T-Rexes really swim? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and I'll catch you guys in whatever I review next. See you later! Shout out to top supporters, Klaxon, Thomas Hinton, Ray Zach, Mr. Zugador, Ross Ward, Poplio the Destroyer, Merendor, Trevor, James Townsend, Artemis the Falcon, Hayley Thomas, and Ross Hextall.